The America's Democrats podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, is made possible by contributions from our listeners. Want to do more? Go to americasdemocrats.org and click Donate. And thank you for allowing us to be your voice. And if you enjoy the show, please share it with your friends on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. This week, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter David Cay Johnston on what we learn from knowing more about Trump's taxes. Author Eric Alterman on why presidents lie and why Trump is worse. And Bill Press with Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times. Had enough of Fox News, the House Freedom Caucus, and Donald Trump? If you want the facts that you won't get from them or from the fake news sites of the alt-right, then stay tuned. Our sponsor, 21st Century Democrats, works hard to get everyday Democrats involved in returning our party to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Sit back and listen, then stand up and fight. And follow 21st Century Democrats on Facebook for all the latest progressive news. We're glad you can join us. David Cay Johnston has spent years reporting on Donald Trump's business practices and on the inequities of the U.S. tax code. He says recent reporting from the New York Times on Trump's taxes offers greater proof of two tax systems, separate and unequal. And we say hello to David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, and founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service, DC Report. His most recent book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And before we go any further, I want to point something out to our listeners. David Cay Johnston identifies neither as a Democrat nor a Republican. He comes to us, as he does with all of his reporting and his writings, in a completely nonpartisan manner. David Cay Johnston, thank you for joining us and welcome back to the program.
Well, Jim, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure to speak with you again. And we do have a lot of ground to cover here, not surprising given the state of our world right now. So let's start with Trump's taxes, something you're quite familiar with. It's been several weeks now since the New York Times dropped its bombshell report that Trump paid $750 in taxes in 2016 and even less in previous years. As I mentioned, you've been reporting on Trump's taxes for decades now. In what ways does the New York Times coverage line up with what you've already been reporting?
Oh, it's confirmed everything in substance that I've been saying for a long time. This has actually been, compared to 2016, when I couldn't get people to listen to me very much, a nice couple of weeks, because the insider books that have come out, the outsider books like Bob Woodward's, have just verified stuff I reported years ago. And in the case of Trump's taxes, he suffered a serious reversal on Wednesday when the Court of Appeals said, nah, you don't have a case, and that his tax and accounting record should be turned over by the Mazars firm to the grand jury in New York. So we're getting much, much closer now to Donald Trump's inevitable indictment and trial.
You know, a couple of takeaways from this, the way we see it, David. And one is that Trump is hardly the businessman he claims to be. And
Right.
Another is that he is flat out a tax cheat. Which of those two takeaways is more important when we think about Trump, the president?
Well, I actually think they're both totally interrelated. Business people create wealth. That's why they start a business, men and women, and they are seeking to improve their economics, not to just spend more money. Donald's like a kid who has a dollar bill burning a hole in his pocket. And as fast as the money comes in, it flows out. He has never in any of his businesses, with the single exception of Trump University, had a dollar invested. He always borrows all the money for a business and takes a fee off the top, or he gets a partner to pay him a fee up front. So he has a negative investment. As for the tax cheating, this is consistent with his lifelong pattern. 4 years ago, I broke the story that to this day, the only major newspaper to mention it is the LA Times in an op-ed I wrote at the beginning of October. And one passing line in the style section of all places, marriage announcement section, or as we call it in my household, mergers and acquisitions section of the New York Times. It gave a passing mention to it that Donald Trump was tried twice for tax fraud. It was civil tax fraud, not criminal. And in that case, his own witness, his own longtime tax lawyer and tax accountant, Jack Mitnick, testified that Donald Trump was a forger. He was shown the tax return and evidence, and Jack looked at it and he said, "That's my signature, but I did not sign nor prepare that tax return." And Trump was lucky he wasn't immediately referred for criminal prosecution. By the way, in that case, he did what the Times has shown he did again. He claimed $600,000 of deductions. He had no receipts and no records of any kind. And yet he insisted and went to trial that he was entitled to deduct $600,000 against a business that had revenue of $0 and 0 cents.
Well, and as you bring that part up, and this is also a story about a tax system that works for rich people and seldomly doesn't go as well for everybody else, or usually doesn't go as well for everyone else. What are some of the most egregious aspects of our current tax code that allow a man such as Donald Trump to pay less taxes than, say, a teacher, a nurse, or a firefighter?
Well, America has two income tax systems, separate and unequal. The vast majority of us who get a paycheck are not trusted by our Congress, both parties. So our taxes are taken out before we get our money. Almost nobody can itemize deductions anymore, like gifts to charity, except very wealthy people. And so we're in a system where we will be fully taxed. The other system is for people who own businesses, private businesses. Donald Trump fits this to a T. And Congress trusts these people completely that they will faithfully report their income. They will only take the deductions Congress has authorized, and they will pay every penny of tax that's owed. And the only risk they run is that they will be audited. Well, the odds of that have been falling and falling and falling. And now, for people who make incomes of $1 million and up, and remember, we have people in America now who make in income more than $1 billion a year. Their odds of being audited are less than 1 in 33. And the chance of being tried and convicted, well, in the entire United States last year, there were 530 tax fraud convictions, and most of those people were drug dealers and politicians who took bribes. So that's the system is just totally out of whack, and we, as voters, allowed this. We elected people in both parties who did this to us. And so it is not the job of anybody except us to fix this. And when I say that, I get kickback. People write me notes. It's not my fault. Nonsense. It is your fault. And it's your fault, even if you voted for the people who wanted to do the right thing, because we need to spend time and money and effort to get rid of all the people who are doing bad things. But most importantly, the campaign finance system that totally corrupts our elected officials and forces them to kowtow to this very narrow group of very wealthy people, many of whom, not all, don't want to pay any taxes. They want you and I to subsidize them.
You recently wrote an op-ed for the LA Times that focused on how the IRS is enforcing, or in many cases, failing to enforce its own tax laws. So how is this happening? And obviously, I think we know who's benefiting from this trend. Right.
Well, first of all, what we've done is we defunded the tax police. That's what the IRS are. They're the tax police. And they're just the people carrying out the rules. They're no different than the blue suits on the street. It is Congress that set these rules in place that favor very rich people and allow multinational corporations to make a profit off the income tax system. Many of them literally do that. And the IRS now is so defunded that in 2014, 15, and 16, 3-year period, almost 300,000 people a year who had a high income, $200,000 or more, didn't even file a tax return. Well, Congress has so defunded the IRS that they're not even trying to pursue more than 500,000 of these rich people who aren't filing a tax return. This is just beyond belief. Now, where has that been reported? DC report. my piece for the LA Times op-ed. Nowhere else. It's not in the New York Times. I offered him a piece about it. I used to work there for many years. It's not in the Washington Post. It's not in the Wall Street Journal. It's not on the nightly news. It's not on MSNBC or CNN or Fox. And people don't know about it. And this is one of the fundamental problems in our country today is we're busy covering the palace intrigues and things, but we're not covering as journalists our government.
Mm-hmm. Again, we're speaking to David Cay Johnston, Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service, DC Report, and talking a little bit about his most recent book, It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. And again, I'll point out, David is not a Democrat or a Republican. He is a nonpartisan author and writer and joins us in that capacity today. Another thing we learned from that New York Times story, David, is that Trump is deeply in debt. Many have identified that as a national security issue. Do you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. First of all, Donald's total debt is over $1 billion. We don't know who all of that is owed to because the disclosure laws that apply to presidents have big loopholes in them. And that's another thing we need to fix. But here's the real problem. We know that Donald owes more than $300 to Deutsche Bank, an organization that I've said from an American point of view is a criminal organization with an American banking license. It is the favorite bank for Russian criminals, the oligarchs, to launder money. And it's very likely that Deutsche Bank has not made loans to Donald Trump. More likely, Russian criminals put up deposits at the bank to guarantee the loans made to Trump. I mean, imagine, for example, your grown child goes to the bank and says, I want to borrow $100,000 to start some business. And they go, you're not credit worthy. So you, having prospered, go to the bank and say, tell you what, I'll put up $100,000. If my kid doesn't pay, you can take it. And now you've both hidden your role and relieved yourself of the fight with the kid if they don't pay you back, because it's the bank that'll go after them. And there's very good reason to believe that's what's happened with Trump, why Deutsche Bank made these loans. And if that's true, then Donald Trump absolutely is under the thumb of the biggest, best funded criminal gang in the world, the people who stole the wealth of the old Soviet Union, Putin and his gang, the oligarchs.
I'm just left shaking my head. It's just, I mean, it's crazy to even think about this. All right, let's turn to your most recent book. It's Even Worse Than You Think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America is the title. You wrote that book over 2 years ago. Is it your sense that the nation is more aware now than it was then of the impact of the Trump presidency?
Well, I think there are more people who are waking up to this, but let's not miss the fact that Trump has incredibly solid support somewhere in the 30% of the country. His total support's in the low 40s. But there are tens of millions of Americans who, first of all, have real legitimate economic grievances. And I wrote a series of books, Perfectly Legal, Free Lunch, and the Fine Print, about how the 90% have had their pockets picked by government on behalf of the rich over the last 40 years, starting with Reagan. That's a big group. Overlapping that group of people with economic grievances are people who hate the civil rights movement. They don't want to sit next to a Latino on an airplane. They don't want to have a black pilot in the cockpit. And God forbid they report to a black woman boss. That would just be the end of it. And those are the people who go around, denouncing political correctness, meaning I want the right to use racial and ethnic slurs against people I don't like. And then the third group are these faux Christians who have no idea what's in the Bible, who think that Donald Trump was sent by God, and who believe that God intends for you to be rich and to heck with everybody else, when at least my deep study of these matters over my lifetime is God wants you to prosper if you believe in God, but the greater your wealth, the greater your duty to care for the poor, not to hold them in contempt. And care for doesn't mean to say some nice words. It means to sacrifice.
I grew up going to a Catholic school, and we learned none of what I hear that comes out of Trump's mouth, and a lot of this base where they have these attitudes. And in fact, we were taught quite the opposite. And it's one of those things where you always hear these, what would Jesus do?
Right.
He wouldn't do any of these things. At least
Well,
that's how I learned it.
and Jim, in my previous book, my Trump biography, The Making of Donald Trump, which goes into his deep entanglements with an international drug trafficker and other things, I quote from a book where he spent 16 pages denouncing Christianity. He calls Christians fools, idiots, and schmucks, not only in that book, but in some speeches that he gave. He says his life philosophy is one word: revenge. If there is anything the New Testament of the Bible completely and totally rejects, it is revenge. And he says that what gives him pleasure in life is destroying the lives of other people. And he goes on and on about how good he felt as he destroyed the life of a woman who wouldn't do a simple, unethical favor for him by making a phone call. And yet Christians embrace this man who is completely against their belief. And the pastors who are telling this to their flocks, they're not Christians. They are deceivers. There's a lot of discussion about deceivers in the Bible, and that you're not supposed to be an idiot and just assume whatever some person who says they're religious tells you. You're supposed to use some judgment. Now, to be clear, I'm a non-believer, but I've studied these matters. I've been a consultant to several mainstream churches. I've actually been paid to give sermons, even though I'm a non-believer, because of people's understanding of my views on morals and ethics.
Before we let you go, should Donald Trump get fired, so to speak, from his current job? And kind of as a second part to that, how hard will it be to undo some of the damage that this administration has caused?
Really important questions, Jim. I wrote a piece of DC Report last week saying we want Donald Trump to live, not just because it's immoral to wish he would die and is bad for us to think that of anyone, no matter who they are, but because we need a clean referendum rejecting Trumpism. If Donald dies before November 3rd, we will not have a clean referendum, and it will haunt our democracy forever. So that's one part of it. Secondly, I do want him to suffer for the things that he's done, and I want to see that he is tried and, if convicted, sentenced to prison. Now, as an old man, he may persuade a judge he shouldn't go to prison. Fine, put him under house arrest. But I want him to suffer for the wrongs that he's done and be a convicted felon. As for the damage that's been done, some of it is unrepairable. I've written about how at the Environmental Protection Agency, for example, where we have millions and millions of highly detailed records of what's called point source solution. These toxics came out of this pipe or smokestack on this date. Those have been compromised, and they may not be usable in the future in court. That is yet to be seen, but I suspect any defendant will attack the legitimacy of those records. They have been destroying records. Trump tears up pieces of paper every day, which is a criminal violation of American law. And they fail to keep records. Jared Kushner, who I think we're going to find out was deeply entangled in the arrest and torture of rich Saudis to pay more money over to the royals, and perhaps even with the death of the Washington Post columnist Jamel Khashoggi. After this is over, we know that they're not following the law on records and things. But the damage in many cases is repairable. It will take a long time. Here's what I hope Joe Biden does, assuming he wins, and that is far from certain, because he can lose the Electoral College even if he wins the popular vote by 20 million votes. I think on November 5th, 6th, 7th, he should announce that if you are in the Trump administration and you committed any crimes, and you come forward, you present all the documents that you have, and you agree to testify, we won't put you in prison. If you don't step forward, we will find you, we will prosecute you, and we will seek the highest, longest prison sentence under the well-established federal government theory of what's called general deterrence. We want to deter anybody else in the future from your behavior. I hope he does that, but it's the tendency of presidents to say, let bygones be bygones. Obama did that when he didn't go after the corrupt bankers. And I've written a lot about that. I mean, it got to the point where Eric Holder for 10 months lied about what was going on, and I proved he was lying. And to me, lying means I got to prove he knew otherwise than what he said. but it remains to be seen. We can recover from this, but it will not be fast. Our institutions are damaged. We've lost a lot of diplomatic, scientific personnel who we have invested a fortune in. I hope that the Biden administration, if there is one, invites many of these people to return to the government and to continue doing public service. And then I hope that we get away from this nonsense notion that everything in politics is corrupt, that the people who work for the government are all on a gravy train, and respect people who dedicate their lives to public service, whether they're school teachers, nurses, or senior scientists at the Environmental Protection Agency.
David Cay Johnston, a nonpartisan Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter, best-selling author, founder and editor-in-chief of the nonprofit news service DC Report, joining us today on the America's Democrats podcast. If you haven't had a chance to check out this latest book, it's even worse than you think, What the Trump Administration is Doing to America. I encourage you to do so. David, as always, we enjoy speaking with you today and would love to have you back again soon.
Happy to do so. Take care.
You too as well. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen to this americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats. But we need you to stand up and fight. Do you want to get involved and help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box? You can make your contribution to help us keep this show going and to elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.
This Social Security measure, I believe that we must pass legislation to provide medical care.
This is our tradition. When our grandparents came to America, it was the Democratic Party which said, welcome. It was the Democratic Party, the party of Roosevelt and Truman and Kennedy and others, who said that America belonged to all its people, not just a handful of the rich or a few giant corporations. That's why great leaders like FDR fought so hard for Social Security, and why JFK stood up to the insurance companies and their Republican allies to get Medicare. It's not just one thing, or one time, in one place. It's about a whole history of standing up to the Republicans and saying someone has to be on the side of regular working people in America, whether it's defending Social Security or just the way your loved ones are treated on the job. That's what the Democratic Party is all about. And that's why this message has been brought to you by the Democratic Party. Working people like you and me.
Paid for by 21st Century Democrats. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. Coming up next, author Eric Alterman on the history of presidential lying and why this time it's different. But first, we turn to Jim Hightower, America's #1 populist, for his common sense commentary.
The holy mantra of health professionals was coined about 2,500 years ago by the Greek physician Hippocrates. Do no harm. Of course, that was before corporate healthcare took charge and asserted a new guiding ethic: jack up profits. Putting this in practice, America's largest and richest hospital chains rushed to the front of the COVID-19 bailout line this spring to pull $15 billion from the government's emergency fund. They pocketed the taxpayers' money despite sitting on tens of billions of dollars of their own cash reserves. But hold your nose, for it gets much stinkier. The bailout was intended to keep hospital workers on the job, yet the wealthiest chains have hit nurses, janitors, and other crucial frontline staffers with layoffs, pay cuts, and deadly shortages of protective gear. For example, HCA, the $36 billion a year behemoth that's wallowing in profits, snatched a $1 billion taxpayer bailout for itself, then demanded hospital staffers accept wage freezes, elimination of company pension payments, and other cuts, or have thousands of their jobs eliminated. However, in a public show of compassion, HCA's chief executive, Samuel Hazen, donated 2 months of his $1.4 million salary to an employee support fund. How magnanimous. No, his generosity is a deception, not a sacrifice. The trick is that a CEO's salary is a minuscule part of total pay. Hazen's annual bonus, stock payouts, and other compensation will raise his actual pay to $26 million this year. So his donation is less than 1% of his pay, and almost certainly he will write that off his income taxes. So we taxpayers underwrite his fat take-home and also subsidize his face-saving philanthropic gimmick. This is Jim Hightower saying what we have here is a raging virus of executive suite greed doing deeper damage to our society than COVID-19 ever could.
If you'd like more of Jim Hightower's real populism, check out the Hightower Lowdown. Jim's monthly newsletter gives you the real lowdown on which corporations, by name, are doing what to the middle class, our environment, and our democracy. Each month, the Hightower Lowdown brings you facts you didn't know, along with actions you can take to fight back. It also comes with a sense of humor. Hightower believes we can fight the gods and still have fun. Plus, get this, it's cheap. Only $15 brings you 12 issues a year. For real populism, go to hightowerlowdown.org.
This is the America's Democrats Podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. In his newest book, journalist and author Eric Alterman explores the long trajectory of presidential lying. And while most presidents have lied, he says, in the case of Trump, there's no comparison. And we say hello to Eric Alterman, media columnist for The Nation and a CUNY distinguished professor of English at Brooklyn College, also the author most recently of Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. Eric Alterman, thank you so much for joining us today on the America's Democrats Podcast.
Happy to be here.
And we're happy to have you with us. This isn't the first time you've written about presidential lying. In 2004, you wrote a book titled When Presidents Lie, A History of Official Deception and Its Consequences. Why did you decide to write another book on this topic?
Well, my first book, which was also my PhD dissertation, was about 4 specific lies, and I've tracked those 4 lies through the culture to show how important it was when presidents lie and the effects of them. They were all, one of them began in World War II, and the others were all in Cold War era. So I knew a lot about lying or presidential lying, because I wrote my dissertation on it. I wrote this 400-page book on it. Nobody else had done that. And when Donald Trump became president shortly afterward, in January that year, I started thinking about how I would account for myself in this period. I had been reading a book by Ron Chernow, A History of the Warburg Family, a German Jewish family, many of whom died in the Holocaust because they never took the threat of Hitler seriously. They never thought they'd have to worry about it. And I didn't think Trump was Hitler, but I also think we weren't taking him seriously. So in order to be able to one day say to my non-existent so far grandchildren, what did you do during the Trump era, Daddy? I thought, well, this is what I know and this is what I can do. And I did it. This book, by the way, just to clarify, sorry, going on. The first book was about 4 post-war lies. This book begins with George Washington. It takes us all through the history of the United States, and then spends about a quarter of the book, about 100 pages, on Trump himself.
Mm-hmm. Now, I was going to say, you begin the book identifying different kinds of lies. For example, there is misinformation and disinformation. Why is this distinction important to make?
Well, misinformation, it's really not. Misinformation is a lie if you don't correct it. Barack Obama was guilty 18 times in 12 years, according to the New York Times count, of presenting the country with misinformation, which he then did his best to correct and never repeated. Disinformation is when you purposely mislead people, and that's much more common among presidents. Trump can disinform you 18 times in 15 minutes. So I think I don't know if this is going to be your next question, but I identify 4 different kinds of lies that I use throughout the book. There's misinformation and disinformation, categories I take from the German philosopher Jürgen Habermas. There's I'm going to say bullshit, because I'm using it in the philosophical sense, as identified by Harry Frankfurt. When I use the word in the book, I put it in quotes. And bullshit, again, in the philosophical sense, is when you just don't care if what you're saying is true or not. And Trump does a lot of that too. He just doesn't bother. Truth is just as useful to him as lies are just as useful as truth. And then the 4th category, which is in many ways the most interesting, is called the bald-faced lie, which again is a philosophical category. And a bald-faced lie is when you the person you're lying to knows you're lying. And so you're not really deceiving him or her. And that is become quite relevant because people are always asking me, why do people believe Trump's lies? Why does his base believe him when he's so obviously lying all the time? And the answer is a lot of them don't believe his lies, and they don't care that he's lying as long as he's lying about the people they don't like. And that's their criterion. They're not interested in the truth. They're interested in being bumped up and being made to feel good like a drug.
Mm-hmm.
And as long as he's lying about immigrants and Muslims and Jews and LGBT people, then it's cool with them. They don't care if it's true or not.
Mm. Now, and you pointed out, the book starts with George Washington and moves up, into the present day. And as you point out, every president, of course, is different, tells different lies. But when you ask that question, why, what are some of the common themes that drive presidential lying?
Well, I have to say, I was surprised when I wrote the book. I have a PhD in history. I read a lot of history. But I was surprised at how central the idea of white supremacy was in the history of presidential lying. I would say for the first 150 years of our country's history, most presidential lies were driven, aside from the obvious kinds of lies that all politicians tell. What was unique about the United States was the centrality of white supremacy and the need for constant expansion. So our Declaration of Independence says all men are created equal. People like to believe that. It ain't true. And presidents are caught up lying to protect the policies that protect white supremacy without admitting that that's what they're doing. Similarly, first with expansion across North America, and then with the creation of empire beginning around the turn of the century with the Philippine War, we've ceaselessly expanded, and we've denied the rights to the people into whose territories we've expanded that we keep for ourselves. And again, we like to think of ourselves as an anti-imperialist country, as an anti-colonialist country. That's what our revolution was about. That's also not true. So that expansion and empire turned into the words national security, which became another reason that presidents were, in many cases, forced to lie. Jimmy Carter didn't want to lie. Bill Clinton wasn't so bad either, actually. It's interesting that he has a reputation for being Slick Willie, but as president, he was pretty truthful, with one glaring exception. But almost all presidents, particularly in the post-war era, have done a lot of lying on behalf of this incredibly expansive definition of national security. And most have done some lying on behalf of maintaining a policy of white supremacy.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the points you make in the book is that each successive president made it easier, if not actually mandatory, for the next president to lie. Give us a sense of how that has and how that continues to work.
Well, I could give you lots of examples, but the one that is most salient now is the lie that candidate Donald Trump told about Barack Obama, that the birther lie, that he was born in Kenya, not in the United States. That birther lie came after more than a decade, I would say, beginning with Ronald Reagan and then expanding enormously under Speaker Gingrich, and then during the Obama presidency, where it became mandatory for Republicans to lie because they couldn't get elected by their supporters without it. You had this whole structure of Fox News and talk radio, Rush Limbaugh, et cetera, Drudge, that demanded lies on the part of the Republican Party and Republican politicians if they want to have any future. No Republican could ever say global warming is a terrible challenge and we need to address it right away. They wouldn't be a Republican politician anymore. They wouldn't get elected. So you had this whole structure of lies waiting for Donald Trump to run for president. And he went one step further with this clearly racist lie. The racist lie that everyone who cared knew was false, but it didn't matter because it stroked people where they wanted to be stroked. And so you had approximately 40% of the Republican Party saying they believe that Obama was an illegitimate president, that he had not been born in this country by the time of Trump's, actually, I'm sorry, I said 40, I meant 70. The 40% figure, which is hard to believe, but it's true, is the number of Trump voters who believed that Hillary Clinton was running a pedophile ring inside a pizza parlor in Washington, D.C. So the system got overloaded with lies during the Obama era, and Trump took advantage of that to the point where lies and truth just didn't matter to voters. They just wanted to feel good about themselves.
Is it just this is what I want to believe, and so I
Yeah.
accept it?
Well, look, I mean, things are going badly for a lot of the part of this country. You know, we have this enormous problem with white people losing power, committing suicide, getting addicted to opiates. Their children are abandoning them in rural areas and so forth. And they don't feel like they have a future. They feel like they want the past back and they want to blame somebody. So Trump gave them someone to blame: immigrants, Muslims, liberals, Jews, they're journalists, professors, people like me, but a lot of people who aren't like me. And he lied in order to support those policies of blame, because obviously that's not the case. So he created, I mean, Trump is a genius in addition to being a moron. He's a genius for telling a certain kind of people what they want to hear, and for manipulating the media into taking completely nutty and obviously disproven ideas seriously. So the media help him, even as he calls the media enemy of the people. They spread his lies for him and do his work for him, because he knows how to work them. It's only in the past year or so have reporters woken up to the idea that you can't just publish what Donald Trump says. I mean, it's more obvious today than ever, but for 3 years he got away with it.
Well, and he knows better than anybody, as you point out, that he needs the media more than anybody in the world right now.
Yeah,
I mean, that's been his engine.
Well, so far, I mean, I think it's a lot more dangerous. You know, when I wrote the book, I was reluctant to talk about fascism because I didn't want to sound like an alarmist. And it's a word that has never really worked in the United States. People called Joe McCarthy a fascist, but he didn't really have that much power as a senator. He had some power, but not that much. Trump, who's probably never read a book that had the word fascism in it, he's an instinctive fascist. He's got a genius for fascism, and the fascism comes from his ability to destroy the whole idea of truth. Hannah Arendt, who is one of the great scholars of fascism, who wrote the book "The Origins of Totalitarianism," noted that if you can destroy the idea of shared truth, you can get away with anything, because anything you say is just as true as anything else anybody says. And that's what Trump has done for his supporters. He's destroyed the idea of truth, and the media helped him along with that, because they would say, on the one hand, Trump says this, on the other hand, the Democrats say that. You decide what's true. We're going to give you both sides, the lies and the truth, as if they're equal. And so, it looks like Trump will be defeated unless he steals the election. If he steals the election, then we'll at least know it. But until that was clear, until the virus came up and destroyed his chances for re-election, it looked like he had a good chance of using these lies to destroy the republic. And the media people in the media would have had a lot to answer for that, in my opinion. A lot of the book is about that.
I would agree with that statement 100%. We're speaking with Eric Alterman, media columnist for The Nation and CUNY Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College, also the author of, most recently, Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. And even with these common themes, this is a book about how this time it's different. Of course, with Trump, there is just the sheer number of lies, which we've talked about. Beginning with the why, what makes Trump a different kind of liar?
Well, the main difference, there's two big differences. One is Trump doesn't care if you know he's a liar. He lies straight to your face. He admits to lying rather a lot. He had a meeting with Justin Trudeau where he lied to Justin Trudeau during the meeting about the trade deficit with Canada. And then he came out and had a press conference and said, yeah, I lied to him. Like, what's the point of lying if you're going to admit that you just lied to another world leader? And the other thing is that he lies about everything. Now, you take a liar like Lyndon Johnson, big liar, got a lot of people killed in Vietnam, disastrous policy. And that's one of the things I focus on in my first book on lies. There's about 100 pages on But he lied because he thought he had to fight this war in Vietnam, and he didn't want to admit that he was losing. We understand why he lied, even though we don't approve of it. With Trump, everything is Vietnam. Every single policy is based on a lie. There isn't anything he doesn't lie about because he doesn't care to find out the truth, and in truth is no more value to him than lies. And as I wrote in a recent Nation column, this fish rots from the head. When Trump lies like this, it gives everybody else in the government permission to lie too. So all the people he's appointed to these DOJ and defense and education, they're all lying. It's commerce, they're all lying too, and that's fine with him. So the government, 4 more years in this, and it would collapse from the weight of its lies.
Yeah. Now let's turn to the what of Trump's lying. Are there categories of Trump's lies that you would consider more damaging than others?
Well, I used to say that the one good thing about Trump was he didn't get lots of people killed. Like George W. Bush lied about Iraq and so-called weapons of mass destruction and everything else, most of everything he said about in order to get us into the war with Iraq. And the net result was millions of people displaced and probably 1 million people killed. Lyndon Johnson lies, together with Richard Nixon's lies, got about 3 million people killed in Southeast Asia. And Trump, he was careful not to get in any war. So he was destroying our democracy, but he wasn't getting lots of people killed. With coronavirus, he is getting lots of people killed, in some ways more directly than the other president. And so, no, there are no categories with Trump because, again, he doesn't distinguish between truth and lies. No matter what he's talking about, he'll lie. He lies about his personal life. He lies about his children. I mean, the guy was 100% successful, lying his entire life in the New York City real estate business, where it's okay to lie. No one loses their reputation in that business because they're known as a liar. If you believe somebody without getting proof and you buy a building from them, it's your own fault if you get screwed. Everybody understands that. So Trump thrived in that. I mean, he actually lost a lot of money, but he thinks he thrived, and he gives the impression of having thrived, and that's how the media helps sell him. So that's the way he operates, and he's never paid a penalty for it. He's gotten away with it his whole life. When he we hope is resoundingly defeated and humiliated on November 3rd, maybe he'll learn a lesson, but one doubts it. But that's a hope that I hold. I would like to see the country teach him something for once.
It would be a feel-good moment. That's for sure. And of course, he's often referred to, Trump is the liar in chief. There are media organizations that keep a running tally of his lies. But does our awareness of his penchant to lie actually blunt the impact of those lies?
Well, I'm a great fan of CNN reporter Daniel Dale, who was hired away from the Toronto Star, because he covers lies in the context that they're made. Like he says, whenever Trump lies, I mean, he can't entirely keep up. If you watch him on CNN, he talks really fast because there's so many lies. But he explains to you why Trump is lying in this particular case and what it means and how many times he's told this particular lie. And I find that very valuable. I contrast that with the Washington Post, who count up the lies, which is valuable to me because they did my research for me in this regard. But they're the ones who say that Trump has told 20,000 plus falsehoods. But they rarely say that in the articles where he's doing the lying. They have a separate article. Say, oh, by the way, he lied over there in that other article. So he gets away with the lies in the article. And then they only tell us that he lied somewhere else. And when he tweets, he lies. And when he gives a speech, he lies all the time. And they're covered in the headlines, in the tweets by media organizations, as if Trump said this and it might be true. We're not taking a position on that. And same thing with his cabinet when they go on the Sunday shows. And they just don't have, because of the journalistic ideology of objectivity, because of the respect for the presidency, because they're afraid of his supporters, which is a very important point. They don't call him out on his lies when he's doing lying, or the rest of his government. And so an awful lot of lies go unchecked and unreported. And again, it's laying the groundwork for fascism if we get it on the term of this guy.
Yeah. Now, this is also a book about how we enable presidential lying, and part of that is on all of us. How do you understand our willingness to accept presidential lying?
Well, politicians lie, and nobody's shocked by that. I mean, not every American president has lied. I can name a few that I couldn't find any lies by, just a few. Didn't help them. It doesn't even help them with historians. Historians don't hold presidents responsible for their lies, and neither does the public. Presidents are judged exclusively on whether or not they're effective, whether or not they're perceived as success, even by presidential historians. And so if lying is part of succeeding in politics, then that's kind of understood. That's one reason. The other reason is that certainly since the Cold War and maybe before, there's this idea that we've been at war the entire time, first in the Cold War and then with terrorism. And Trump would have us be at war now with China. And if he's telling us the truth, then he's telling them the truth. And we don't want them to know the truth because we're in a war with them. It's the old idea of you don't publish troop movements during wartime. So people feel like, well, if the president feels he needs to lie, he knows what he's doing. I don't need to know. I just need to know if everything's working out. That's how people have felt. Walter Lippmann wrote a book in 1925 called Public Opinion, where he made this point that people don't really care all that much about democracy itself. What they care about is effective government. And if that means taking shortcuts in a democratic way, people are mostly okay with it.
Can you imagine a time when there is a new norm in politics that sets a higher standard for truthfulness from the White House?
Well, even Mike Pence would set a new standard of truth in politics if he succeeded Donald Trump. No one, I mean, he's a phenomenal liar. I've never seen anything like it. I never heard of anybody who lies the way he does, except like in comedy sketches. So anyone would be better about lying. But the idea that what I would like to see is the media, which is a plural noun, by the way, I always try to emphasize that, are the members of the media holding the president to a higher standard because of the danger that they learned from allowing Trump to get away with what he has. That's one hope I have for this book.
I have a hope that I know won't come to fruition, and that is some of his own party would start to call him out as well. But we're over 3 years into this. We're coming up on the end of the fourth, and I guess that's just never going to happen.
Yeah.
And we'll leave it at that. Eric Alterman, media columnist for The Nation, CUNY Distinguished Professor of English at Brooklyn College. His most recent book, Lying in State, Why Presidents Lie and Why Trump is Worse. Eric, thank you so much for your time with us today. We appreciate it and look forward to having you back with us again soon.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you. And this is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Help get our party back to its roots and to success at the ballot box. Make your contribution to keep the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, on the air, and help elect stand-up Democrats. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. This is the America's Democrats podcast, the weekly podcast for stand-up Democrats. And now Bill Press with Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times, on the latest election polls and why 2020 is not 2016.
I think President Trump is the most vulnerable incumbent president since 1992. He has not had a lead in any battleground state that he needs to win for months. Even if you think that there's a sort of shy Trump effect in some of these surveys, it's not enough to get him to win these states. It's only enough to get him to lose them more closely. And unless something dramatically changes in the next 3 weeks, he is the decided underdog going to Election Day.
Are we making the same mistake we made in 2016 by assuming that?
No, I think these are two very different elections, very different circumstances, very different candidates. President Trump, I think in 2016, was viewed as somebody who was not Hillary Clinton, and that was his overriding appeal to a lot of voters. He was not.
Yeah.
And I think people who otherwise would not have supported him but couldn't bring themselves to vote for Hillary and voted third party are not going to vote third party this time around. It's important for your listeners, if you go back and take 5-10 minutes, and if you look at the state-by-state returns in 2016, you will be surprised at just how many votes, if you add them up, the third-party candidates received state by state. I'm talking 6 to 7% in some states. That's a lot of votes, especially in a close race.
Right.
That's just not going to happen this time.
Right.
You can see every survey makes clear people are making a binary choice.
Right. Could Donald Trump still turn this around in the next 20 days?
Yeah, I think it's possible, because if this year's proven anything, it's that making sweeping predictions is a fool's errand. And yeah, I think it's certainly possible. The challenge is that he would have to dramatically change his behavior, and there's nothing, Bill, in his history to indicate that he will change his behavior. In fact, it's the opposite. Everything about Donald Trump indicates he's not going to change. And look, I can tell you from talking to voters, from looking at survey research, the biggest challenge with this president is his behavior. We did a story last week, my colleague Alex Burns and I, about the Sun Belt. And you talk to voters, it's not the policies. They can't abide his behavior. And he's not going to change that. And if anything, the debate and his COVID diagnosis have made that challenge, in particular, even more daunting for him.
Right. I was going to ask you about that next. So it was a great story in Saturday's New York Times about the Sun Belt. And I mean, you're on the ground, you're talking to these people. Those of us living in the bubble in Washington don't always have that perspective. But I mean, you looked at some states which we all have always considered red states: Arizona, Texas, Georgia, Florida. And you really see some change in those states.
Yeah, I mean, I do. And, having grown up in Virginia and having watched this happen in my own state, I'm not terribly surprised. The power of demography, as Daniel Patrick Moynihan once said, demography is destiny. And I think that in politics, there's some truth to that. Places like Virginia and Colorado, which because of the vote shift of college-educated white voters have become reliably blue states. And I think that you're seeing something like that increasingly happening in places like North Carolina, Georgia, and Arizona. It's taking longer. It's more complicated for a variety of reasons. But anywhere where you've got a coalition of college-educated white voters and non-white voters, it's going to give Democrats a real advantage. And I think that's what's happening across the Sun Belt.
Arizona in particular, you think is in play for Biden?
I do. In fact, the two polls that we've taken at the New York Times, and I hope that your listeners will check this out. We've put a lot of money into our own survey research this election. Unlike 2016, we're doing a lot of our own polling, and we've taken two polls of Arizona, one in September, one in October, and they were basically the same, Bill. Trump at about 40% in both polls. And I don't have to tell you, if you're an incumbent president and you're at 40% a month out, that's a warning sign. And so I think the president is in trouble there. And I think it's going to actually have a larger impact on the rest of the ticket in that state, where, by the way, the Trump era could have handed them two senators. It's possible that Arizona will go from the start of the Trump era with two GOP senators and end it with two Democratic senators. And this is a state that has a long history of being a pretty Republican state. But again, demography, population growth has really shaped Arizona. And it's all happening in and around Phoenix. and they just cannot stomach Trumpism.
You and Kelly also talked about Georgia. And since then, I saw that on CNN, our friend John King said, I showed the battleground states, and the only battleground state where Donald Trump was winning was Georgia, and he was winning by one point.
Yeah, and we've seen some private research that actually has him down in Georgia. So I think it's a really competitive state. What's fascinating, Bill, is I think it's hard for some Democrats to wrap their arms around the idea of Georgia and Texas being competitive. I think Democrats have largely come to terms with Arizona being a kind of Virginia/Colorado type state demographically, and they're playing hard in Arizona. I think it's harder for Democrats to understand what's happening in Georgia and Texas because those states just have been so forbidding and they have seemed so difficult to win. And I think this is partly the result of 2018. Democrats won the Senate seat in Arizona in 2018. Kyrsten Sinema beat Martha McSally. Mm-hmm. And the two marquee races in Georgia and Texas in 2018, Democrats fell short. Stacey Abrams narrowly lost the governorship, and Beto O'Rourke narrowly lost his challenge to Ted Cruz. And I think because they fell short in those two high-profile races, there's still a hesitation among Democrats to believe in Georgia and Texas. They think that they're competitive, that they are going to be more competitive in the years ahead. But I think there's worry that those are money pits where we're going to spend a lot of cash to get 47.5 or 48, and it's just not going to be worth it when all is said and done. That's what's fascinating in the course of my reporting is that, as one person said, the biggest skeptics about Texas turning blue are Democrats. They're just not quite there yet.
It's been a long time, Jonathan. So
1976.
There you go. Among the other states, should Democrats have any confidence at all in Florida? That's the key state, isn't it? I mean, Donald Trump has to win Florida. Yeah. You agree?
I do. It's must win. There's no question about it. I think Florida remains difficult for Democrats because it's not like a sort of North Carolina, Georgia, Arizona, where you've got this sort of pretty straightforward story of increasing non-white vote share and college-educated whites who are becoming more Democratic. It's more complicated for a lot of reasons that I won't go into today, but the two biggest ones are more retirees coming into the state who are pretty conservative, one, and two, increasing Hispanic migration from Central and South America that is more sort of up for grabs politically, but they're not as democratic as Hispanic voters are in other parts of the country.
Right.
And I'm thinking in particular of folks from Colombia and Venezuela, for example, who are not as conservative as sort of Cubans a generation ago, but they're not Puerto Rican voters either. They're not automatic liberals, So Florida's more complicated for Democrats. It's definitely doable. And yes, it's the backbreaker for Trump. It just takes a lot of money and it's just not easy. There's a reason why the only Democrat to win that state in recent years has been Barack Obama on the national level.
Right. So we're talking presidential, but I just want to shift for a moment because while we're talking Sun Belt, the front page story, lead story in the New York Times Monday morning was Jamie Harrison in South Carolina raising $57 million in the last quarter against Lindsey Graham. Yeah. I mean, wow.
It's staggering.
Right?
Yeah. It's hard to comprehend that much money coming in a Senate race in a quarter. But this is what Lindsey Graham has wrought by, being one of the biggest, if not the biggest Trump lieutenants in the Congress. He has created a sort of movement nationally of Democrats who, Bill, effectively have made his defeat the second biggest priority of this year. Yep. And that's what the race has become. Less about South Carolina, less about Jamie Harrison, more just about, Democrats' determination, not just to beat Trump, but to defeat people that they see as his enablers too.
Right. And you, like I, must find it amusing when Lindsey Graham goes on national television and whines about Jamie Harrison having so much money and begs people to send him money, right?
Yeah, I mean, it clearly shows that they recognize he's got to do something to stem the money flow coming into Harrison. And I was going on Fox and openly asking for money is one of the better ways to do that. So
Sure. So let's jump from the Sun Belt to the Rust Belt. And there we're talking states that Democrats used to win, and they lost them to Donald Trump in 2016 as we know. Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin. What do you see there? What are people telling you there?
Well, we've got polling coming out this week in Michigan and Wisconsin that continues to indicate Biden's got an advantage in both states. I think those two states, and then Michigan, Wisconsin, and add Pennsylvania, are what tipped the election last time. But if you add, Bill, the combined margin in the three states, it could not fill the capacity of the big house, the University of Michigan football stadium, to use a sort of local reference point. So I think it's going to be tough for Trump to hold those states because everything fell into place in 2016 for him to carry those states in the first place. And it's just going to be harder this time. And it's going to be harder in large part because of his challenges with female and college-educated white voters. He didn't do great with those folks last time, but he's really tailed off this time around. And he's going to win working class white voters again, but it's not going to be the margin that he had against Hillary Clinton 4 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's going to be hard for him to hold those states. I think every time that I go to those places and I talk to voters, it becomes more and more clear that they were not voting for Trump so much in 2016, Bill, but they were voting against not just Hillary Clinton, they were voting against the Clintons. And I think with that off the stage, I think it's just easier for them to vote for Biden to get rid of Trump. That's the recurring theme that I pick up talking to folks out there. And I just think Biden's an easier sell. David Axelrod has made this point, right? He's culturally inconvenient for Donald Trump. He's an older, white, Irish Catholic, heterosexual male from Scranton, PA originally. That's just tough to demagogue if you're Joe Biden or if you're Donald Trump, Yeah.
He's tried it. But it hasn't worked.
But it's a political bank shot, Bill. And bank shots in politics are always tougher, right? And anytime in politics you hear somebody say that the other guy is going to only carry water for somebody else, that the other guy is only going to be a sort of stalking horse for somebody else, that's a giveaway that you don't have a clean shot in a political debate. When you're having to invoke your rival somehow, helping the person C, and it's not an A versus B contest or attack, Bill, that's just a tougher line of attack politically, right? The easier, cleaner shot is attacking your opponent for problems that your opponent has. When you're attacking your opponent for problems that a third party has, it's just tougher. And by the way, I don't care what race that we're talking about. It could be this campaign or any other campaign. That's always more of a challenge for a candidate in politics.
Jonathan, you've mentioned demographics a couple of times. When you look at the key demographic groups today, whether women or Latinos or African Americans, white voters, white men, women, Donald Trump, I believe, only leads in one of those categories, right? White men.
Right. Yeah. No, I mean, if you look at any polling, Bill, and you just look at the crosstabs, women, independents, moderates, college plus white voters, suburban voters, in a lot of cases, senior citizens. These are demographics where he's not just losing in some cases, but losing decisively. And I think it's just hard to win in America in 2020. Even with the Electoral College, if you are running to maximize a heavily male, non-college white base, that's just difficult. It's tough to do that and win election in this country. And this is the biggest mystery of Trump. I shouldn't say mystery because it's not surprising, but this was the biggest, I think, sort of miscalculation of Trump, that he could run for re-election without ever really doing anything to expand his base.
Right.
Every president, after they're elected, tries to expand their coalition to get more voters in the re-election. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But they all try. This president never really tried. In fact, in a lot of cases, he did the opposite, right? All of the insults, the name calling, the invective, he constantly did that. Nobody ever really told him that it was hurting him, or if they did, he didn't care. And that is what could spell his demise now, was his behavior. And again, it turned off the very people that he needed to add to his coalition.
Bill Press with Jonathan Martin, national political correspondent for the New York Times. If you'd like to hear the entire interview, visit BillPressPods.com. And that's all for the America's Democrats podcast. Thank you to all who made today's show possible. David Cay Johnston, Eric Alterman, and the entire Bill Press team. And thank you for listening. If you liked what you heard, please get involved in our efforts to keep this show going and to elect Democrats who are bringing the party back to its roots. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page. And be sure to find 21st Century Democrats on Facebook and Twitter, and leave us a review on your favorite podcast app. For the America's Democrats podcast, I'm your host, Jim Cuddy. We want you to sit back and listen, but we need you to stand up and fight. Join us. Support the americasdemocrats.org podcast, a project of 21st Century Democrats, and help elect Democrats who will stand up for democratic principles with your contribution today. Go to americasdemocrats.org and click on Donate at the top of the page.